Hey there, ninth graders. Welcome to today's notes video on projectile motion. Our essential question today is, what is projectile motion? So this might be something that you are not as familiar with, so we're going to dive right into this today. So first, we're going to define what projectile motion is. A projectile is an object that's thrown or shot through the air. The key here is that it is not under its own power. So things like airplanes or helicopters or things like that that fly through the air, those are not considered to be projectiles because they are under their own power. They have a power system that allows them to keep going, right? Whereas a projectile is something that flies through the air, but not under its own power. So in other words, something had to put it into motion to start with, and then that object is eventually going to come back to the ground because it's not under its own power. So something like a bullet fired out of a gun, or a baseball thrown through the air, or a bow shot out of an arrow, those are all examples of projectiles, okay? The motion of a projectile typically creates what we call a curved path, or a parabola, is another word for that. And that's because of there's two types of motion that a projectile experiences. So the first type of motion is what we call horizontal motion. And that horizontal motion is the motion that is produced by whatever put the projectile into motion in the first place. So if it's a bow shooting an arrow, or if it's your arm throwing a baseball, or if it's a bat hitting a baseball, or your arm throwing a football, whatever the thing is that produced the horizontal, or that produced the force, is what creates the horizontal motion. And we know that that horizontal motion is parallel to the earth. So if you don't know what horizontal means, you can kind of visualize what parallel to the earth means. And I'm going to show you a diagram in just a moment here as well. The other type of motion that a projectile experiences is vertical motion. This is motion that is produced by gravity, because we know that gravity pushes down on objects all the time. And the vertical velocity is going to increase as it falls towards the ground at a rate of 9.8 meters per second squared, because that's the rate of acceleration due to gravity on Earth. So these two types of motion are what create the curved path of a projectile. So the way that they do this is that the vertical and horizontal motion act completely independent of each other. So a ball thrown horizontally versus a ball dropped from the same height, they will both hit the ground at the same time. And so if you watch the Mythbusters video on Friday, you already know this, right? Because you saw them do a bullet fired out of a gun versus a bullet dropped, and they both hit the ground at the same time, okay? And that is because the vertical motion and the horizontal motion are completely independent of one another. One does not affect the other, okay? So I'm going to wrap this video up with a little kind of drawing of this to hopefully make it a little bit more visual for you and easier to understand. So this will be the last thing for today. All right, so now that we've talked a little bit about horizontal and vertical motion when it comes to projectiles, I wanted to just kind of draw this out for you and give kind of a explanation summary of what we've just talked about in our notes. So the first thing is that we talked about how projectiles have horizontal motion, which would be in this direction, and that's caused by some force that gave them that motion. That might be throwing, that might be shooting out of a gun, that might be something like that. The projectile also has vertical motion, which is caused by gravity, or G, okay? And so we just talked about how these types of motion are completely independent of each other. And so they create what's kind of that curved path, which we call a parabola. And that's the path that the object ends up taking as a result of these two different forces. We've got the force pushing in the horizontal direction, and we've got the force pushing in the vertical direction, which is gravity. And so this is the curve that we get. And so basically the idea here is that gravity does not just take a break on objects that are moving horizontally, okay? Just because it's moving horizontally doesn't mean that gravity isn't still affecting it the same way it affects an object that's dropped straight down, okay? So even though it may look like or seem like an object that is going, horizontally to the right, even though that object may appear as though it takes longer to hit the ground, what we know to be true in terms of physics is that that object is going to take the same amount of time to hit the ground that the object that was dropped did. And that's because these two things, the force that caused the horizontal motion and the force that causes the vertical motion are completely independent of each other. One of them does not affect the other. And so gravity is going to affect all objects in the same way, regardless of if they're moving horizontally or not. So hopefully that kind of sums up the idea of projectile motion for you. All right, so that wraps up our video for today. Please reach out to your teacher if you have any questions. Thanks.